My name is Tim Stewart-Winter. I teach in the history department here. And I am thrilled to introduce Dr. Don Romesburg, who is the author of Contested Curriculum, LGBTQ History Goes to School, a book just out from Rutgers University Press, and we have copies available for those who would like to purchase one. Professor Romesburg is also the editor of the Routledge History of Queer America, which is a landmark reference work and super helpful encyclopedia for all of us who work in this field. He also was the lead scholar working with advocates to pass the Fair Education Act in California, which helped usher LGBTQ content into California's 2016 K-12 History Social Science Framework and subsequent textbooks. He now trains educators on implementation. And for these efforts, he is the namesake of the LGBTQ+ History Association's Don Romesburg Prize for K-12 curriculum. Romesburg is also a co-founder of the GLBT Historical Society Museum in San Francisco and managing editor of TSQ, Transgender Studies Quarterly, which is housed at the Clayman Institute for Gender Research at Stanford. And he's a visiting professor in history and women's gender and queer studies at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Did I pronounce
Obispo?
Obispo,
yeah.
San Luis Obispo. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Don Romesburg.
Thank you so much, and thank you for all of the institutional parts that helped to bring me here. It means a lot, and I know how these things get cobbled together, so thank you. It's great to be here. So today I'm going to be talking about this book, and I'm going to take you through parts of it. I'm also going to talk about this contemporary moment that we're in, because we are in a moment of acute crisis for LGBTQ inclusive education in the United States, and it's certainly part of a much larger international attack on LGBTQ inclusive schooling, public life, access to health care, and it's connected to the widespread so-called anti-DEI movement that has impacted so many, but certainly impacts both K-12 and higher education in the United States and beyond. And so I'm going to try to sort of contextualize all that for you a little bit here today, and then I'm really interested what you all have to say about it, and we can kind of talk about that. The cover and all of the artwork that's inside of the book comes from the Queer Ancestors Project, which is a project that partnered queer and trans young adults and youth with an artist who, for the last, since 2012, so I'm bad at math, 13 years? Is that right? No. Yes. Yes, thank you. Has worked with these young people to do printmaking based around queer and trans history. And so this particular one I really love. It's from a non-binary Asian American person who really wanted to have a statement about how they carry with them the memories of their ancestors, but also the wounds and the traumas of intergenerational struggle. And when I saw this, it really jumped out to me as something that was so perfect to be on the cover here. So as I go through, I won't sort of tell the story of each image, but I'm just going to kind of put them up so you can see them, and if you want to learn more about them, certainly there are artist statements on each of them in the book. All right. In 1995, 17-year-old Allison Holzer of Richmond, Indiana, beat out 34 students from across the United States to win the Lesbian, Gay, and Straight Teachers Network's first annual Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual History Month essay contest. In it, she wrote, quote, "My friends have their rich family and cultural histories, as do I, but most of them also have the history of their heterosexuality. A big part of me and many other young people in this world is not taught to us. Knowing our history would not automatically make us happy, healthy human beings, but it gives us a source of strength, something to fall back on when we falter. Gay, lesbian, and bisexual history is important to me because it's part of who I am and who I wish to become." Written just a year and a half after she'd come out to herself, Allison's essay highlighted the total absence of lesbian, gay, and bisexual subjects in her history curriculum. For most of her K-12 years, it had not occurred to her that past people had taken journeys similar to her. And I should say that her omission of transgender was an artifact of that era of the 90s when the T was still being reincorporated into the LGB. She saw both the limits and potential of history education as a vehicle for this necessary memory work. Beyond just instilling a sense of pride through the introduction of historical role models then, inclusive K-12 history education could have helped her pave pathways into the future. History gave her, quote, "a connection with others who have the same roots, people who I might not otherwise have anything in common with. By studying the queer past, she understood how she belonged to a diverse, forward-looking community rooted in mutual respect, struggle, and celebration." Over time, the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Teachers Network became the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network, and later just GLSEN. In 2017, GLSEN National Student Council member James Van Kulenberg, a transgender high school student from West Virginia, wrote a similar essay for the organization's blog, saying, quote, "We as students and educators must make a concerted effort to highlight the stories of transgender people, which have often been erased from our history textbooks, especially the stories of folks with multiple marginalized identity, like trans folks of color." He recounted how, in 7th grade, he won first place in his school's social science fair with a biography of trans Civil War veteran Albert Cashier. This was despite a teacher who had told him he'd, quote, "never heard of something like that." James added that while the history of trans people is very important to me as a history nerd, it was also very important for every young person. Like Allison, he endorsed LGBTQ-inclusive K-12 history education as, quote, "proof of existence and affirmation of identity." Yet, he added, the, quote, "benefits of teaching trans-inclusive history reach further than trans students themselves. It can alter the school climate for the better." In saying those words, altering school climate for the better, James echoed the 2 decades of the Safe Schools movement that had unfolded between Allison's essay and his. And I'll talk more about the Safe Schools movement here in a bit. So LGBTQ inclusive K-12 history education does a lot of work simultaneously. For LGBTQ+ students, inclusive history education can enrich their identity, community, safety, and success. And there's tons of research that backs this up. For all students, it facilitates a school climate of belonging across differences. And indeed, we know from research that when you teach LGBTQ content in the curriculum in K-12 classrooms, it improves the school climate overall in terms of civility and belonging and bringing down bullying. For our society's emerging citizens then, such an education promotes civic engagement, tools for navigating a pluralistic democracy, and critical citizenship skills. So my book explores the history of LGBTQ inclusive K-12 history education in the US. What began with fits and starts across the late 20th century led to formalization of an inclusive curriculum through legislation by the 2010s. First with the passage of California's Fair Education Act in 2011, and then subsequently in 2019 first with New Jersey, and a handful of others. I'll talk more about that in a bit too. As we learned in doing this work, as I was active in the passage of the Fair Education Act and what came after it in California, subsequent implementation of the law presented its own challenges and opportunities. I've learned a lot about the difference, the gaping canyon, I should say, between such a bill becoming a law and curriculum actually showing up in classrooms and textbooks. I think that some of us who worked so hard to get that law passed in 2011, in hindsight, were incredibly naive about what a law did versus what you have to do to make a law actually be implemented on the ground. And certainly, I mean, anybody who's worked on, for example, anti-discrimination law or hate crimes law would know that there's a big difference between getting a law passed that says people shouldn't do this and people not doing that thing, right? So over the last, whatever, dozen years or so, I've talked to dozens of educators that have either enthusiastically or reluctantly educated themselves and their students about this field of history for which almost none of them had received any prior training. As a historian, I've wondered why the 2010s were the era in which this deceptively simple idea that all students across elementary, middle, and high school should receive LGBTQ inclusive history education, how it broke into the mainstream. As a queer person, though, who grew up through the AIDS crisis and its related culture wars, I've been waiting since 2011 for the backlash. And here we are. Since 2021, we have endured an unprecedented legislative assault against LGBTQ plus people. And I really need to emphasize that as a historian. What is happening now, especially in the area of education, is literally unprecedented. We have had times in the past where there have been waves of anti-LGBTQ curriculum laws, mostly around what were called no promo homo laws in the 1980s and 1990s. But those laws were contained to health education. They were basically part of sort of overreach around HIV/AIDS and fear that teaching young people in their health education how to prevent the transmission of HIV or the contraction of AIDS, that would promote homosexuality to them, right? And so there were many states, including California, that passed laws that said that you cannot promote homosexuality when you're doing comprehensive health education. And those laws certainly had a chilling effect. I'm going sort of off script of my book here, in many states. So my mom was a high school teacher in Utah in the late 1980s and 1990s. And she was an English teacher, and she was told as soon as she got hired for that job, do not say anything about homosexuality and do not say the word condom in your classroom. And she was like, oh, why? And they said, well, we have this law that says we can't do that in Utah. Well, the law was just about health education, but she was being told that as an English teacher, right? And so there's a huge chilling effect in terms of that kind of law. But what's been happening now is much more comprehensive and about curriculum generally, and not just about health. So this has been connected both in sort of an administrative and a legislative and a judicial way to a moral panic over what the right imagines to be so-called critical race theory or so-called grooming being taught in K-12 public schools. Attacks on the rights and health of trans youth and attempts to censor discussions of racial inequity and justice have understandably overshadowed the wave of bills across the nation that have proposed the banning of or the requiring of parental permission for the teaching about what they call sexual orientation and gender identity in all subjects, including history. Of course, when they mean that, they don't mean teaching about straight people who are married, right? In 19 states, as of June of 2025, these have become laws. These don't say gay or trans or parental notification laws, right? In 19 states since 2021. That's very, very fast, okay? Meanwhile, in 2024, Washington became I did want to say the last state to pass one of these prohibitive censorship laws was West Virginia, which I think is chilling given that James Van Kulenberg, right, in 2017 was writing about how he had been able to do this work that had been really, really instrumental to him around a trans historical figure, right? He would not be allowed, presumably, to do that anymore. Or he would be discouraged from doing it, I should say. Meanwhile, in 2024, Washington became the 8th state following California, New Jersey, Illinois, Colorado, Oregon, Nevada, and Connecticut to require the inclusion of LGBT content in K-12 history education. So the history of this, the existence of this history in classrooms clearly matters, whether it's to people who want to support it or to people who oppose it. But why, right? So I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on this because I want to get to sort of the rest of the talk, but I will say that there's something very specific and important, I think, about history education compared to other forms of education that we need to think about. One is that the task of history education, or one of the many tasks of history education in K-12 public history in the United States, is to empower students to become engaged in a diverse democracy. This necessitates a curriculum inclusive of the historical processes by which various peoples emerged as rights-bearing subjects, right? And how, in particular, some populations, like LGBTQ+ people, moved away from persistent criminalization and pathologization, right, and toward other kinds of possibilities for public, civic, and private life and cultural expression. So because history education plays this specific role, and it's different than the way in which you might be inclusive in, say, English language arts, or certainly something like in STEM, LGBTQ history can be taught in terms of rights and restrictions, and cultural expressions in relationship to other forms of belonging and difference. So rather than being about sex, or compelling educators to take contemporary political positions in regards to LGBTQ+ issues, history education provides both the difference in subject matter and in time that might make inclusion feel safer than in other subject areas. And I'll bring this up again at the end when I talk about the Mahmoud Supreme Court ruling from June that has huge implications here. Okay, so I want to move from here then. I can talk about the social science and education literature that shows why this is important and how it's important, but rather than try to convince you that it's important, let's just all assume that it's important and kind of move on to the history from here. But I'm happy to talk about it in Q&A if you have questions about that sort of justificatory material. I will say it's mostly about windows and mirrors, so anybody who's in education knows what that means. All right, so what we have here is two different images. One is from the 1980s, and one is from 1990, 88 and 90. The one that's over here, the big poster, is one of the first LGBTQ sort of curricular supportive materials that was created with the intention of it existing within K-12 classrooms. In order for there to be a space within K-12 classrooms where this kind of material could be displayed, a couple of things had to happen first. And this is kind of what my first couple of chapters talk about. First of all, there had to be a field called LGBTQ+ history. And that really emerges as a scholarly field in the 1970s. and is becoming more articulated by the end of the 1980s and really accelerates in the 1990s, to the extent that there's a ton of scholarly material available from which people can create lesson plans and other materials for K-12, right? That's like a really important thing that has to happen. Another strand that has to happen that I talk about in the first couple chapters is that you have to be able to be out as an LGBTQ plus educator, or it has to be safe for you to be someone who can teach this content without being summarily fired for teaching the content. And what's interesting, and it echoes in something I'm going to talk about in a bit, is that those first cases about mostly gay and lesbian, although there are bisexual and trans educators in the 1970s through the early 1980s who have to defend their right to be a teacher and be known in some way as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. One of the things their lawyers basically have to argue is, well, of course they're not going to bring it up in the classroom. Like, yes, they're going to be a great teacher, and they are a great teacher, but they're not going to bring it up in the classroom. And in fact, over and over, what ends up happening is when they win their cases, they end up getting reassigned to district administrative offices instead, right? Trans people fare worse within the law of the late 80s and early 90s. And generally don't win their cases. And I think part of that is because of they sort of, unless they can sort of fully pass as the gender in which they live, right, it's something that is more visibly written on them, right, and therefore perceived by people as more threatening. But spectacularly, and it's too long of a story for here, but spectacularly, something called the Briggs Initiative fails in 1978 in California, which would have made it illegal for people who were lesbian, gay, or bisexual and or supportive openly of lesbians, gays, or bisexuals from having any role within schools. Like, you could be a janitor who said that you went to a pride march, and by that law you would be able to be fired for that, right? That fails by public referendum because of an incredible mobilization effort in 1978. And it mobilizes a lot of people to think about how education is actually a really important space. And so you start to have, in the very early 80s, these first guides to help K-12 educators think about how they can incorporate lesbian and gay, at that point, content in some ways into their classroom. You also have some work being done on that in Philadelphia and in New York. There's a really great supplemental that comes out in 1989 out of New York called The Struggle for Equality. It's this incredible thing. It brings in the Harlem Renaissance. It brings in stuff around the early gay rights movement, what's called the homophile movement. It brings in what's called the Lavender Scare, right? The Martin McCarthyite persecution of lesbians and gays and bisexuals that far is greater than the McCarthy sort of Red Scare in terms of its scope and timing, right? But here's an example that I really like what it does and the work that it does. So this was put out to commemorate the first National Coming Out Day. The Gay and Lesbian Community Action Council of Minneapolis printed this poster. And is this a poster that's familiar to anyone? Like, has anyone ever seen this? No? Yes? No? Okay. Some of the kind of older people in the room, no offense, Jim, might remember it as appearing maybe like in their college, like, multicultural center, as they used to be called, or whatever, right? Right, it displays 10 famous historical figures with the headline, "Unfortunately, history has set the record a little too straight." The poster's images of people such as James Baldwin, Willa Cather, Eleanor Roosevelt, Bessie Smith, and Walt Whitman thus implies that they were in some fashion queer. And because I don't expect this isn't a vision exam, so I'll just tell you what it says down here. It says, assume that all important contributions are made by heterosexuals, and you're not only thinking straight, but narrow. Sexual orientation has nothing to do with the ability to make a mark, let alone make history. So, what's problematic about that as a statement? I'll say it again. I'm just curious what you all think. Assume that all contributions are made by heterosexuals, and you're not only thinking straight, but narrow. Sexual orientation has nothing to do with the ability to make a mark, let alone make history. Yeah?
It's sexuality is like a disability or like a deficit that like would, under this like initial point of view, bar gay people from being able to make a meaningful impact on society, and it kind of doesn't recognize the fact that that adversity often drives a lot of these people to make change and impacts the kind of change that they make. I mean, a lot of these people listed here are writers, and their work is in some ways been in, like, I mean, I didn't know about Walt Whitman, but I mean, Virginia Woolf's work has been read in a queer lens. Baldwin, of course, wrote Giovanni Groom. Like, their sexuality does impact the change that they make, but it's not just solely because of their sexuality, but it's too dismissive.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And so it fits into some of the sort of, it's like a parallel to kind of the colorblind language of the time, where it's like, right, as Michael Jackson said, it doesn't matter if you're black and white. Well, maybe it matters, right? Maybe it matters a little bit, right? But I mean, it makes that kind of statement of like this, you should get over the fact that these people are queer and still appreciate them in history, right? I liked how you said that. So, I mean, it also has some other sort of strange ambiguities. A viewer might reasonably wonder, well, were they or weren't they, right? Because it doesn't actually identify them. And of course, identifying them in terms of their sexuality has its own problematic sort of things going on with it. But what this does, I think, very well, is it gives this kind of winking refusal to spell out how and why these figures constitute LGBTQ-inclusive history. And because of that, it found its way into classrooms without raising too many eyebrows. And so as a selective conversation starter, and a nod to students who might identify an educator who posted it as safe for them, it makes a lasting contribution. And there's a lot of this kind of, not a lot, what I found was some evidence of this kind of under-the-radar approach to incorporating LGBTQ content during this time. So bottom-up and localized history curriculum and materials in the late 80s and early 90s were undoubtedly groundbreaking. But to gain a lasting foothold, LGBTQ-inclusive history education required both state action and community-based efforts at local and national scales. So during the late 80s and 90s, while a handful of cities initiated supplemental K-12 lesbian and gay history curriculum, California and Massachusetts activists took their efforts statewide. Changing state policy held the promise of facilitating widespread implementation that would then get baked into the system. So the safe schools models of this time really take off across the 90s. And they end up having this incredible traction at a time when state-level inclusive history education becomes a collateral damage in the wider culture war battles. And so in California in 1987, they have something called the History Social Science Framework, which is more or less sort of, here's all the content that you should put in your K-12 history classroom, right? It's like standards, basically. In the 1987 version, which was vaunted nationally as like a landmark in terms of its inclusiveness of diverse peoples, telling a story that was both sort of a quote-unquote common story of the American past and a story that incorporated important aspects of what was then called multiculturalism. It was also celebrated because it didn't go too far in straying from the so-called common culture of the United States by representing sort of other kinds of diversity. And so as LGBTQ organizations start pushing against this, and here we have Jesse Greenman holding up the same sign as here in 1990. Jesse Greenman worked for GLAAD in San Francisco and something called the Bay Area Teachers Network. They advocated for inclusion in the 87 framework, and then they advocated again for it in the textbook adoptions around the 87 framework that happened in 1990. Here she's pushing, those are a bunch of protesters who are saying Project 10 was a modeled after something in Los Angeles, but essentially it's a program within the San Francisco School District at the time that was being proposed to create safe spaces for LGBTQ plus youth in the schools. And so these are anti that, right? So the American Family Association is one of the organizations that sort of is putting this on, and they're holding up the sign. And then she bravely went behind them all and just stood with a blown up version of this poster behind them as a kind of counter demonstration to what they were doing, right? So I kind of love that that echo that's happening there. But at the state level in California, they really struggled to get any kind of traction at all. As Dan Chernow, vice chairman of the curriculum committee at the Department of Education said, decision makers tended to see the diverse people who testified for the curriculum becoming more diverse as, quote, interest groups who, quote, want to see the history taught strictly from their perspective. This was certainly not true, but this is the way that the Department of Education saw it at the time. At the same time, the Bay Area Educators Group and Project 21, which spring out of GLAAD at the time, tries to align themselves with activists of color who are seeking to widen the narrow lens through which they collectively asserted that most of the history social science framework and textbooks narrated the past. In hindsight, and I go into great detail on all the sort of the ways in which this plays out in the book, but just to kind of jump, their demands were quite modest compared to other calls for change. Rather than seeking education based on multiple lenses of difference, for example, Greenman and her collaborators simply wanted a basic acknowledgement that lesbian, gay, and bisexual people had existed, that their struggles for rights and recognition was something that was historically meaningful. This nuance was ignored by all of the policymakers. Over and over, state decision makers and the mainstream media framed lesbian and gay claims as the radical extreme to which identity politics would take history education if it acceded to other multicultural demands. So in other words, it was like, if we give in to multiculturalism, even queer people might be included, right? They seem to fear. So what's remarkable about this is that this is really what we ended up doing with in 2014 through 2016 and 17 with the History Social Science Framework in California and the textbooks, but we didn't know that this had happened before, right? It's a real humbling reminder of sort of how quickly activism and activist movements can be forgotten, and also mad props to Jesse Greenman, who in the mid-1990s when this was falling apart, when her organization and stuff was falling apart and kind of it all failed and it wasn't a success, she printed out all the emails. And I don't know, for those of you who are historians in the room, it's a really big deal, right? Because these like digital artifacts just go, they're just gone. You just never can recover them again, right? She printed out all of the emails and they were at the San Francisco Public Library. And I was able to be like the first or the second person after COVID lockdown to go back to the main public library in San Francisco. And I remember walking through, it's like 6 stories high, this completely dark, huge building with my mask on, one like person accompanying me like 20 feet ahead, the archivist. And I was able to be there for 4 hours at a time, and then in the afternoon they let one other person in. So it will always be sort of seared in my brain, both the begging to get in, to work on my book, getting in to look at these papers, and then opening up and being like, Oh my gosh, there's so much here, right? It really became the backbone of all the stuff I was able to do around this. So Massachusetts led the early safe schools movement. By the early 1990s, a handful of educators there had already built early gay-straight alliances for young people and were developing and teaching some inclusive curriculum. By 1993, they successfully appealed for state buy-in, and the achievement of this cannot be overstated. It accelerates a shift nationally from a 1980s discourse of viewing so-called sexual minority youth as at risk to the 1990s safe schools model. So rather than managing problem students, which is the at-risk model, let me say that again. Rather than managing problem students, schools came to be understood as problem environments, right? So the environment needs to be fixed, not the student, right? Groundwork by educators was bolstered by the 1989 U.S. Health and Human Services report on the Secretary's Task Force on Youth Suicide. This was a Republican report, by the way, Republican administration's report, which quantified the disproportionately high rates of suicide attempted by lesbian and gay students and urged state and national governments to do something about it. Safe schools promoted institutional supports, such as non-discrimination policies, GSAs, culturally competent staff providing safe zones, and curriculum was not in the mix, and it's because Massachusetts sets this precedent. During the 1992 hearings to establish the Governor's Commission on Lesbian and Gay Youth, GLSEN lobbies for age-appropriate inclusion of lesbian and gay issues in school curricula and focuses on history. Unfortunately, in the wake of a controversy in New York over something called the Rainbow Curriculum's inclusion of just 2 mentions of lesbian and gay parented families, which causes this huge brouhaha, there's a pushback in Massachusetts on this. And so the majority of the Commission on Lesbian and Gay Youth in Massachusetts sees curriculum as politically untenable, and Governor William Weld, who was a moderate Republican who was otherwise extremely supportive of safe school efforts, orders it dropped from the report. On May 20th, 1993, the Boston Herald's front page headline read, "There'll be no gay school lessons." And so this moves to the creation, the 90s, where we go back to sort of opt-in supplemental materials. And what's interesting here is like that's where lesbian, gay, bisexual, what we call now LGBTQ+ History Month is born, out of this desire to bring in sort of supplemental alternative things because they can't get it into the actual curriculum. There's fights over the next 10, 15 years to try to do this work, and then finally the Fair Education Act is passed in 2011. And I go into a lot of reasons to explain why this happens at this moment in time in the book. But essentially, what's important to know is it was passed in 2011 after 4, 5, 6 attempts over the 90s and 2000s to make this happen. It revises the state education code to say that history, social science education has to include the roles and contributions of LGBT people and people with disabilities. This is where it also includes people from different racial backgrounds and immigrants and women and people from different religious backgrounds and so on. In 2016, 2017 then, there's this huge fight that we engage in to get the framework revised to align with the Fair Education Act, among other things. And then finally, there's a huge push in 2017 to align the textbooks with the framework, and then there's all this implementation work that happens. This is how successful those of us who were in this movement ultimately were. In 2016, when the History Social Science Framework comes out, and I go into great detail on how this works in the book, we have LGBTQ content in grades 2, 4, 5, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. This had never happened before in the US. It is a profound sort of sea change in what is possible by showing that age-appropriate, developmentally appropriate, rigorous, scholarship-backed history education can happen in primary, middle, and high school was something that was groundbreaking that California did. And it sort of sets the precedent for other states to be able to do this work. We thought once again naively, that our work was then done. And then we realized that all the textbook providers sort of summarily avoided or downplayed the LGBT content, right? Because they wanted to be able to sell textbooks in more, even though California is a huge market, they wanted to be able to sell textbooks in multiple markets, right? And so they wanted to sort of downplay that for other states, right? So we had to push, do these, like, there was a dramatic 2-week period where we were like reading line edits of every single textbook that was being proposed in California and responding to it. And here's the small sort of hardy group of people that did that work in 2017. And we ended up getting Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, which is like a huge elephant in the room of textbook providing at the K-12 level. We were able to get the California Department of Education to reject their textbooks, in part because they lacked so much of the LGBTQ content in the framework. So all the ones that did then incorporated something like 50 to 60% of the LGBTQ content that was in the framework. So again, this was truly history making, that we had all students across the state reading from textbooks, even if their teachers did not teach the content that they were supposed to, their textbooks had the content for them to discover. So, by the 2020s then, or by 2019 I should say, we have a reason to feel kind of optimistic, right? Sort of what changes in that landscape. Here's where we are now. The olive states are the states, this is by the Movement Advancement Project, by the way. I strongly encourage people to take a look at it. It has really great visuals around all sorts of LGBTQ plus issues. The olive ones are the ones that have formally inclusive curriculum laws. There's a number of others like New York and Massachusetts and Maryland who have inclusive curriculum policies but not formal laws, right? So there's more than that. But everything that's orange has some kind of LGBTQ curriculum censorship law. Either a don't say gay and trans law or you have to give parental notification, sometimes up to 30 days before you bring LGBTQ content into the curriculum, which is prohibitive. And then I last want to say that the other sort of big hit that has been taken is Mahmoud v. Taylor. So for those that don't know, in June of 2025, the Supreme Court, in a along party line 6-3 ruling, ruled that parents have the right to opt children out of educational materials and instruction that their parents find religiously burdensome. And this is around specifically LGBTQ picture books in elementary school in Maryland, right? So it's not a school that has an inclusive curriculum law, but a policy, right? And so the Supreme Court says that parents should be able to opt out in advance as a recourse for this possible discrimination against their religious rights. And in much of the language of the decision and in the oral arguments that preceded it, the majority seems to conflate English language art books that in some way tolerate or promote tolerance or diversity with health education content that might be sexually specific, right? Sex specific, I should say. Sotomayor has an incredible statement in dissent that is signed on to by the other 2 liberal justices that basically says that there should be education, or there should be accurate, that public education needs to be accurate for all students, that this is a form of censorship functionally, and that it's a slippery slope, right? If you do this kind of censorship, if your parents can opt out of this, what else can they opt out of? She says, if you believe, for example, if you have deeply held religious beliefs that women shouldn't work outside of the home, should children be able to opt out of all of that? What if they don't believe, they have deeply held religious beliefs against evolution or against the world being more than 7,000 years old? Should they be able to opt out of that as well, right? So, I mean, she brings up some very good issues that absolutely the court has not determined or thought about at this point. So there are a variety of, this is the New Jersey principals organization, and they have their own kind of statement that you can Google on parental choice in Mahmoud v. Taylor. I couldn't find if the New Jersey Department of Education had given specific guidance. And then the dangers moving forward from here are over-obeying in advance, right? So I mentioned that there's this chilling quality to these kinds of laws where people overreach far beyond what they do. This is just about picture books. It's just in English language arts, and it's just in elementary school. It's up to others to interpret whether or not it goes wider than that, but there has been no determination of that so far, right? So if you're an educator, don't obey in advance. There's a danger that when LGBTQ content is taught, it will be taught in like a special set-aside curriculum that to invite opt-out. So there are all sorts of democratic processes that determine, like the framework and the standards and the textbooks and all of that determine what content will be taught in public schools. And this disrupts all of those processes by allowing people to bring lawsuits to just say, I want my kids to opt out of this. And there is a danger that this can be, people will hope that they can ban LGBTQ content in elementary school and therefore contain it to elementary school. But for anyone who thinks that, I point them to Florida's Don't Say Gay law, which first began as a K3 law, and then became a K8 law, and then came through high school, and now of course they're coming for higher education in Florida, right? So I caution that. And then I just want to kind of end on another sort of data point that I think is very interesting. There's a wonderful trans journalist who does a report, a Substack called Aaron in the Morning. And she found that, according to public records, since the Mahmoud decision, only 0.3% in the county that this was decided upon for the whole United States by the Supreme Court, only 0.3% of parents opted. 0.03%. Thank you. It's a much smaller number than I just kept saying. 0.03% of parents opted their kids out of LGBTQ plus education in that district, right? So a very loud, very small minority is being allowed to dictate what all of our kids, all of our families, and all of our teachers in schools have the freedom to teach and should be teaching. And so I just want to kind of end on this hopeful note, which is that there's an incredible amount of resources that are out there now because of everything that's come since the Fair Education Act that stands on the shoulder of a firm foundation of both scholarly work and curricular work that was done for 20 years before that. And that we have the opportunity now in places like New Jersey to do the work that should have been done all along and to expand that work. And so I encourage educators to do that work courageously and to show how it can be done, because there will be a time, whenever it is, however long in the future it is, when this culture war is over. And when it is over, that curriculum, those materials, and those laws will still hopefully stand, and kids will still be able to learn this content. So I'll kind of end there. Thanks.
Thank you so much. We have time for Q&A if there are folks. Yeah, we have already several hands. Do you want to call on folks?
Thank you so much for your talk. It was super interesting. I had a question about, so in New Jersey, we have the curriculum mandate as you discussed. So I had a couple of questions that I'm wondering if you can sort of help me understand how New Jersey fits into the kind of larger national picture. So in New Jersey, the LGBT curriculum
By the way,
mandate,
thanks for coming, everyone that's leaving. I know, I get that you got to go, but I appreciate you being here. I just want to say that.
classes. So the LGBT curriculum mandate in New Jersey is throughout the curriculum.
Yes.
So like science teachers, math teachers are all supposed to incorporate LGBTQ materials into their work. And I guess I'm wondering, one, how common that is in states that have adopted the curriculum or a curricular aspect, or is it more like the history and language arts and the rest, science and math, gets set aside? And then the second question I have, in New Jersey, the mandate is unfunded.
Yep.
which causes, you know, a lot of problems, right?
Yes.
So the state is saying, all you teachers have to do this, there's no money to like help you train or, you know, provide resources for that. So I was wondering also how common that is in your research to have these kinds of mandates unfunded.
Yeah. So on your first question, New Jersey was the vanguard of what was to come. California was doing something more modest, and I think because it was the first and because of where it fit into California's education code, they wanted to slip it into that place. Like, we don't even have for world history, it's just US history because of where it happens to fall in the ed code. Literally, that's the reason. But most of the states that have followed have been more expansive and across, basically it's a full inclusive curriculum mandate. On your Illinois is about history. That one specifically is, but yeah, I think the rest of them are more expensive. On the funding issue, yeah, of course, I talk about this in the book, but we were able to do what we did in California with a small number of people who were well organized and profoundly underfunded, and the Department of Education didn't fund any of it. The only way we were able to get some funding for implementation was because when the framework got passed in 2016, they had 2 years of California Department of Ed like workshops and conferences around the state to teach educators how to teach the new framework, and they would always bring me or another LGBTQ content expert as the Fair Education Act person to do that work as well. But when that rollout stopped, the money dried up, and it was not, I mean, it was not much money, right? The advocacy organizations who did this work in California found that donors weren't interested in it. And one of the things I talk about in the conclusion is that maybe now that we are so under attack in this area, maybe now the Human Rights Campaign, GLSEN even, and major funders of liberty and justice and democracy will see this as a priority area for funding. But so far, no. Oregon did put a little money behind their implementation, and as far as I know, they're the only state that really put some money into it. So everybody's doing this with almost nothing. Yeah.
How do you think the Mahmoud ruling is going to impact the foreseeable future, like further sanitization of history, LGBTQ inclusion in textbooks? Because it's just a little eerie. Because I just filled out the FAFSA, and I think I believe the last FAFSA they finally included non-binary, and prefer not to say, there's a spectrum, acknowledging that there is a spectrum, but in the recent FAFSA, because of the presidential executive order, now it's only limited to male and female.
Right.
So I'm just wondering, like, how would happen, I guess that's.
Yeah, I mean, those are two different, right? So from an administrative standpoint, I think that, we saw a University of Texas professor get fired for talking about the existence of trans people in a classroom, for example, right? Which then became an entire sort of University of Texas policy, right, that's being put down, right? So different states, I think, are going to respond to this very differently. But from an administrative standpoint, I think that we're going to see an acceleration of what was already a fast-moving train to create more censorship and more threats for teachers who are willing to do this work in their classrooms, especially in red states, but I think in other states as well. I think that Mahmoud opens up the door for parents' rights groups, as they're called. It's always hard because I'm like a dad, right? I'm like, what parents are you talking about? It's not me, right? For parents' rights groups to bring lawsuits against school districts, and small, especially rural school districts, aren't going to want to have to shoulder the legal cost burden of lawsuits, and so they're going to try to find ways to kind of work within sort of the constraints that are put forward. I have been reading a lot of sort of right-wing materials coming out of Mahmoud, op-eds and news stories and activist things, and I'm not an expert on the far right, which I guess is now just the right, but what I've noticed is that what they're trying to do, generally speaking, is to recommend that parents put forward something that's essentially like an a la carte proposal to their districts that are like, you should give us a list of all the things that we might find offensive, and then we should just be able to check off which ones we don't want our kids to be able to have access to learning about. To my knowledge, no district has taken them up on that far-reaching, sort of expansive version of it yet, but I don't doubt that there will be some districts in some states that will, right? I think that far more commonly what we're seeing is what we have been given a snapshot of by Erin in the morning, which is that many parents either are supportive of having this content or just have busy lives and don't care, either way about it, and they're not going to go through the process of trying to opt their kids out of specific things here and there. So the lawsuits will be the things that determine how expansive it is. And I think that history education in particular has a real opportunity here. I said this at the beginning, but just to really underscore, if you teach about LGBTQ content in English language arts, which is the area that it was being taught in Maryland that the lawsuit was brought around, then the Supreme Court's rationale that this is about diversity and teaching people tolerance of people who are different than them, that is the main agenda of the material being in the curriculum. Which I think is a perfectly great agenda, by the way. But I think history education does something else. It talks about rights movements, right? It talks about persecution. It talks about change over time. It's not about advocacy, right? It's not about so-called DEI. And so I think because of that, a particular argument can be made for history education as being outside of the purview of the Mahmoud decision. Now, whether or not the 6 justices on the Supreme Court will be interested in that nuance is a whole other question, but I think that that's a specific opportunity, right? It's different than if you're teaching LGBTQ content in STEM by, as many teachers do, in places like New Jersey, being like, here's Alan Turing, and here's this queer person, here's this trans person who did this thing in science and this thing in math, right? And that seems to be diversity for diversity's sake, which again, I'm wholly in support of, but I think is the kind of thing that people could find actionable under Mahmoud. I'm not a legal expert, but that's kind of where I see the opportunity for history education being specific.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm really curious about what kind of conversations you had during those textbook conversations that ended up considering accountability measures for schools. Just sort of know where it landed, but what was being imagined. I do work on this here in the state, and we've gotten some accountability measures, but they're still like, people really were accountable? So. Right.
No, I mean, New Jersey, to its credit, sort of has like this reporting hotline, right? Or at least it did initially. That was like, if a teacher is not doing this or a school is not doing this, you can tell the Department of Education, and the Department of Education question mark, right? It goes to a voicemail box. I don't know, but
at least department. So
okay, but at least that like is something that exists, right? As I always say about the Fair Education Act and everything that came after it, they had no carrot, meaning there's no funding for it, and they had no stick, meaning there's no consequence if you don't do it. And I think that generally that's the case. I think that's why it's so important to get it into textbooks and other educational materials, because then students have access to it, whether or not teachers teach it, and it nudges teachers in that direction, especially teachers who are not unwilling to teach it, but unsure how to, which is most teachers, right? And it gives them like tangible ways that they can do that work. Yeah, but we had to push the textbook people, and I talk about this in the textbook chapter, but there's some real absurdity to the way it's done in California, where by the time you get the proposed textbooks from the publishers, you can only make minor edits after that. And so, like we would say, rather than saying women in the West, you say gender in the West, like in a section of the 8th grade textbook or whatever. And there was real question over whether or not that was a minor edit, for example. So we had a lot of those kinds of problems. So I think the real thing that should be happening is that LGBTQ plus scholars should be consulted and working with textbook and other educational material providers when they're preparing the draft for what they're proposing to states for approval. I'm not sure if in this particular political climate that's going to happen, but I think that's the answer. Yeah. Yeah.
When I was reading the book, I was very caught on this one part of chapter 3.
Let's see if I remember it.
It was talking about like one straight dad, even after 2 hours of discussion about age-appropriate LGBTQ history like topics, was still worried that it would amount to like speaking about sex acts or teaching about sex acts. And that made me think about the very intentional like misunderstanding of DEI and like critical race theory and all of this stuff. And do you think that there are cases where you have a conversation with people who just have a very immediate emotional reaction where they're very adamant about not understanding what you're trying to speak about?
Yes, I mean that comes from focus groups, right? That folks that were working on this on the advocacy side learned that generally speaking, people aren't swayed by this will make school safer for queer kids, and they weren't. They kept thinking this would be about teaching gay sex or like saying that, I don't know, Abraham Lincoln or whatever is gay, right? Like outing people in history, and that was all they thought it would be about: sex acts and outing famous figures, right? And that's not actually what the field of queer and trans history is about, as it turns out. But to convince them that was really difficult. And so what was more efficacious, what was more effective, was to say history education should be accurate, it should be inclusive, and that's because it makes better history education. It makes our students better historical thinkers, critical thinkers, it makes them more civically engaged, and it promotes greater levels of student success. And once we shifted away from a safe, like history education is a model of safe schools, right, in the classroom, and to this sort of student success and honesty and accuracy model, many, many more people got on board with it. So, I mean, that was a huge shift in the way that we thought about how we would frame this material. Yes, in the back.
Yeah, so I appreciate you being here. Something I've been thinking about a lot is, the comments on, like, we need the textbook manufacturers to, like, buy into this, right, to develop, curriculum. I'm wondering if, in your research and from your perspective, what role do you see the teacher preparation program playing in perhaps mitigating some of these concerns here, right? Because if, hypothetically speaking, the university is like this free entity, right, that has academic freedom, well, then the curriculum at the university that prepares the teachers can be, right, redeveloped to then put a new generation of teacher out into the public.
Yeah.
And so is that something that has come up with what you've been doing?
Yeah.
Anything like that?
It is so important. It is like one of the most important areas for this to happen. And it's because you have LGBTQ plus scholars and people who know the work of LGBTQ plus history, whether or not they're LGBTQ plus, working in universities around the country. These universities also have schools of education. There are people who do LGBTQ plus ed school, right, scholarship, but there's also people who do this history. And the more those are brought together, the more student teachers will kind of come up through being like, well, of course we do this. Why wouldn't we do this, right? In the same way we teach about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, and like, why wouldn't we be doing this work, right? And then the other thing that happens when it happens in teacher prep and teacher education programs is that the mentees go out into the field with senior mentors in the field, and they mentor the mentors on how to do this work and how to have inclusive libraries in their classroom and how to teach this content in age-appropriate ways. And it transforms those field I always say older, and I don't want to say that. The field educators, right, in field educators, it transforms their teaching potentially too. So I think that's a place where you have the greatest possibility of impact. And there's places like Colorado where CU Boulder's doing some amazing work around this, for example. I was doing a lot of this work at my previous institution. I kept asking, do you want my help? Do you want my help? For years, and they were like, I don't know. And then finally, it was the multiple subjects. So the lower, the TK through 6 folks who ultimately were like, yes. And so I was teaching like 2 to 3 class periods every semester in their teacher prep program for those folks. And it was, for some of them, not because of me, but because of the content, it was revelatory for them. They simply it had not occurred to them, and they did not know that it was possible to do it in a way that was easy and non-invasive and non-sexual and age-appropriate and would be good for all the students. And when they when they went out and did it, they were like, wow, this is so great to do this work. So I strongly, strongly encourage those of you who do this kind of scholarship to reach out to your schools of ed and say, how can I get involved? Because I think it's a huge thing that's important. Thank you for that question. It's such a good one. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello, good to see you again. I have 2 questions. You can answer whichever one you want.
Okay.
And so I know this comes out of like a unique San Francisco, California environment.
Yeah.
And I think that for me, I think about like the development of this LGBTQ history curriculum kind of like in tandem with the development of ethnic studies and also like critical race theory.
Yes.
And I'm putting your work in conversation with like the development of textbooks that like essentially there's like this like suppression of content around like inaccurate retelling of history.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about the 2015, I think it's called the McGraw Texas textbook, where they're
Yes.
like trying to say like, oh hey, like stolen African people were immigrants, and it's like
Right.
trying to retell the story of slavery.
Right.
And so
I know, suddenly they support immigrants.
yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. And so I think sometimes there's this like false premise that LGBTQ history is white and ethnic studies history is straight.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering, at least like how do you negotiate race in your curriculum, and how do you view your work in conversation with critical race theory or the ethnic studies pedagogical premise?
Yeah. So 9th grade, one of the places that was on there that it's in, that's where ethnic studies was supposed to be slotted in California. It's kind of embroiled in a bunch of stuff right now, but that's where it was going to be. And so we made sure always that when we were talking about LGBTQ plus content, that it was intersectional and thinking about race and gender, sort of in other vectors of social difference and belonging and identity. And in addition to that, we always pushed the policymakers and the textbook providers and said, do you see here it says lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. That means you need to have lesbian and gay and bisexual and transgender in all of these places. So we really pushed them on that one. When they started thinking they were going to meet the mandates of the Fair Education Act, they were going to have Harvey Milk and gay marriage. And they were like, done, right? And so we were able to get them to talk about indigenous Two-Spirit traditions and the ways in which that comes into contact with settler colonialism. There's mentions in there about same-sex relationships in enslavement and emancipation and in Reconstruction, right? As well as we got them to acknowledge the existence of sexual violence as part of the process of enslavement, right? And racial terrorism after the end of slavery in the United States. There's a lot about the Harlem Renaissance now that really thinks about it as a queer, black, trans moment, right? So we continually sort of tried to make sure that when they were including content, it wasn't just, as Alan Barabee says, right, how gay stays white and the kind of white it stays when he writes this essay about that in the 1990s, right? So we wanted it to be intersectional from the jump, and because we were working from that space, that's what it ended up looking like in the framework, and that means that's what the lesson plans being generated about it, that's what the materials being generated about it are doing. And so when ethnic studies curriculum starts to look at how can we bring in LGBTQ content, there's already that source material for them to work with. So that's what we tried to do. It's not perfect, but that was the attempt, and largely we succeeded. Yeah, I would say the place, to be completely frank, where we did not succeed in that regard is around Asian Pacific Islander histories, which are already really truncated in US history K-12 curriculum. Yeah. I love the cover art, by the way. It really is fantastic what they did for your book. My question is this, I feel like the two great flashpoints of political repression in the United States today are sort of queer and trans stuff and Palestine. And I mean, that plays out in K through 12, that plays out in universities, and I'm just wondering if you, from the view in the trenches in California, I mean, do you see these as separate movements of political repression, or do you see intersection, overlap, even in like the flow of dark money to reactionary organizations that are sponsoring a lot of this? Yeah. Just what's your sense of the relationship between those two sort of political repressive? I mean, certainly. Right now, there are two battling forms of ethnic studies being played out in California for K-12, right? And it's because of Palestine and sort of an accusation of sort of how do we think about settler colonialism? Do we think about it in relationship to the Israeli state and all of that, right? Should Palestinians be included in a ethnic studies curriculum that is supposed to be based around major sort of categories of race and ethnicity in the United States, right? Those are the debates that are happening in that area. But it's hard to say that the dark money is like dark, first of all, or just about Palestine, because because of the Project 2025, right? I mean, there's such a confluence of all of these things simultaneously with anti-so-called DEI, right? I always try to remind people, we were doing work around difference and intersectionality before there was the word intersectionality. We were doing what's now shorthand as DEI before there was the phrase DEI. Like in my professional lifetime in the last 20 years, like we weren't calling it DEI back when we started, right? It's like, that's a catchphrase for these things that change over time, right? The language is more around multiculturalism, whatever, right? So I think it's important to note that, I'm going off of what you asked, but number one, there's a huge concerted effort, and it has to do, in a large sense, with shrinking who gets to exist in public life and who gets to feel safe expressing who they are, who they belong with, the kinds of things they affiliate themselves with in the classroom and in the university and in public and political space, right? And I think that these things are all part of that same story, right? But I do also want to say, I think it's important that we don't fight too hard for certain precious phrases like DEI, and instead think about keep doing the work, right? Not in ways that hide the work we're doing, but just be flexible with the language through which you're doing it, because ultimately it's the work that's important, not the words. That's aside to what you were saying. Did you raise your hand?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, like, how can students and teachers themselves, maybe community members, LGBTQ members themselves, resist or push back against legislation being pushed, because it feels kind of weak.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. For time, I didn't go over this slide. In my conclusion, I give all of these suggestions for doing this, right? Number one is, if you are a teacher, use the resources that exist. The amount of resources that exists now versus what existed in 2011 when the Fair Education Act gets passed is so profoundly different. There's so much great content out there, lesson plans, primary source materials that have grade-aligned stuff in them, all sorts of incredible content. Textbooks for younger grades, right? Picture books for younger grades. So use what's out there. Second is get involved at your local level. So it's boring, but go to school board meetings, get involved with the school board, get involved with the library board, get involved with libraries in your communities, because back in the 1980s, the rise of the new right was in part around the religious right being very effective at gaining traction within these low-stakes, small, local elections like library boards and school boards and things like that. And it's really important to recognize that that's happening again now, and so pay attention to that. I would say make sure that you're doing the work. If you're doing the work yourself in your classroom, make sure that you're coordinating with other people who are doing that work, and make sure that you have support from administrators and others to do that work. The more we can coordinate this work, the more powerful it becomes, and the more it's able to sort of stabilize itself against these kinds of threats when they come from this sideways. Again, what was really, really effective for us was to not talk about safe schools and diversity and inclusion, and instead to talk about historical accuracy and academic excellence and historical thinking, and those kinds of things really convinced a lot of folks that this was important education that had been denied to their students and their kids previously, right? That was a really powerful thing we were able to convince people. I've already kind of talked about these, and then I just say at the end, the other thing is that we have to convince funders that they need to be doing this work, and that this is something that they need to be prioritizing, and we need to convince politicians that if they want our vote, they need to be supporting this kind of stuff at the local level, at the state level, and at the national level, that this is an important issue to us. And by doing that, we are pushing back against this idea that this is inevitable, right? We don't have to end up in The Handmaid's Tale, right? We can push back on this, and we have a better platform from which to do it than we ever have. So the challenges, the headwinds are greater than they've ever been, but the infrastructure, the foundation, the supports that are there are stronger than they've ever been as well. And so we just have to remember that we're in a fight for reality, basically, for what is reality, and we can win. Yeah. Yeah.
I know in your work you have had the opportunity to look at, or a lot of California's history textbooks. I wonder if your work has allowed you to look at other states' history textbooks to see what is included, what is omitted.
It's a great project. No, I haven't done that.
Yeah, so it's the pieces I'm trying to do, but it's
Yeah.
really hard to
It
get
is
access
hard.
to textbooks.
It is hard.
And I'm like, how did you do that? What, like,
Okay.
you know, like research
Yeah, fair enough. I guess I can say this publicly. So like I had some, so first of all, once textbooks are adopted, they are hard to get access to, right? And they're very expensive to buy just on your own to like buy them, right? And so some textbook providers were willing to just give them to me. Like I said, I'm doing a research project on, I'm a professor, and they were like, sure, we'll send that to you, right? Some school districts were doing textbook adoptions at the time, and I would talk to teachers or people, this is the part I maybe shouldn't say, teachers in those districts, and I would say, hey, can you get me a copy of that textbook, right? And I would get it that way. So that was a way that I did it. But it is hard. And textbooks are used less and less by classrooms, and yet they are still extremely important to classrooms and to teachers to figure out what they're going to teach their students, whether they're doing it on Chromebooks or in textbooks or whatever. And so I think textbooks are still this incredibly important research area that is a bit of a black box. New York Times did a side by that was really good, side-by-side Texas and California, right? But I think reaching out to something like the American Historical Association and asking if they would be willing to partner with you on it is a great idea. So look to these organizations that have more infrastructure, research infrastructure, and see if they'd be willing to do it. I would love to see GLSEN to do some of this work.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's also hard to figure out what teachers are doing in classrooms. That's the other black box. Yeah.
All right, thank you so
Yeah,
much,
thank
everybody.
you.